In advancing the increasingly urgent task of achieving a world free of poverty, hunger, and environmental degradation, putting the concept of comparative advantage to effective use within CGIAR and beyond constitutes a really promising opportunity to accelerate impact at scale. And now is an especially urgent moment for accelerating impact at scale for agri-food systems transformation. Comparative advantage in research for development is a cutting-edge research topic precisely because innovations in this space aren't like the simple consumer goods on which the concept of comparative advantage was originally developed. David Ricardo, the economist in England who first popularized and formalized this notion, was using examples of trade of cloth and wine between England and Portugal. In laying out comparative advantage theory originally, he was using very simple, fully private goods. The CGIAR case is a little different in that we're talking about producing public goods. And public goods-oriented research for development, the research tasks that need to be undertaken, these organizations don't have a natural market price feedback mechanism like a cloth producer or a wine manufacturer does. So the price mechanism is what often guides sensible portfolio allocations within for-profit companies. Commercial firms are constantly looking at the market to guide them on how should we reallocate our effort. CGIAR can't take advantage of a market price mechanism because there is no market for research on gender equity or research on improved management of the commons. CGIAR, however, can help us push thinking about comparative advantage in this research for development space, not just to the benefit of its own portfolio management, but also to help position CGIAR on the frontier of research for development, a space that includes renewable energy, a space that includes conservation resources, that includes the responsible use of artificial intelligence. In all of these domains, we likewise need to think about comparative advantage. CGIAR can contribute to that thinking through its wise application of these principles to its own research for development portfolio management. Understanding comparative advantage really leads to two key insights about how organizations with different capabilities can gain from collaboration. The first is, as Josh already so nicely illustrated, is that while it's possible to have absolute advantage in all deliverables, it's not possible to have comparative advantage in all deliverables so long as there are other possible producers. There is always going to be some opportunity cost of doing one thing versus another. And so long as all other organizations aren't exact replicates of CGIAR, those opportunity costs are going to vary across organizations, and that opens up opportunities for gains from collaboration. Comparative advantage in one area implies comparative disadvantage someplace else. And thus, any efficient allocation of activities across organizations doesn't involve doing everything at which one is best. It involves figuring out what is one relatively best at doing and with whom should one partner because their relative skill set is different. A second insight of comparative advantage analysis is that while productivity can be identified purely by looking within one's own organization, analyzing comparative advantage necessarily requires assessing the core competencies of other actors in multiple areas, both those who are presently in the same spaces in which you operate, as well as those who could be in those spaces, because they have the fundamental capacities to work in that area, even though they don't do so presently. So comparative advantage analysis must consider the capabilities of other organizations in producing multiple types of output, some of which perhaps they aren't producing right now. Put differently, it requires thinking hard about your own resources, but equally paying attention to what others are doing.
Just to summarize what Chris just said as succinctly as possible, comparative advantage is fundamentally about comparing the trade-off between different deliverables across organizations, not just about the trade-offs between inputs and outputs within an organization. And to be fair, that's a pretty tall order. It is hard for organizations to even know their own capabilities, And we're asking organizations to now think deeply about the capabilities of other organizations, some of which are active in this space and some of which aren't, but could be active in this space. That's a very difficult task. In the absence of detailed knowledge about the full set of possible production plans at every possible organization that might be active in this space, the best way to learn about comparative advantage may be to consider an organization's characteristics and to think through what they might imply about potential production. Those sources of comparative advantage can be broadly grouped into 4 categories. First, we should think about incentives. We need to think about the degree to which a given outside organization is willing to pursue a particular set of goals. How aligned are they in their priorities in the spaces in which we're operating? Second, we want to think about human capital. We want to think about the skills and knowledge of the organization's workforce. Do they have the right talents for the task at hand, which we hope to collectively work towards? Third, we might also want to think about biophysical capital. Do they have access to labs, genetic materials, and the relevant equipment to produce the outputs that are necessary for the goals we share collectively as organizations? And then finally, we might want to think about social capital, the set of existing relationships and agreements with other actors that might help synergize research efforts in similar areas, facilitate the take-up and impact of research outputs in the field. It may be that some organizations have tremendous capability on the production side of a particular output, but may have very limited resources or capabilities in diffusing that through communities that need to learn about it, that need to be socialized to its value. And so we want to think about, as we think about both our own organizations and we think about other organizations that are playing in this space, are we aligned on incentives? Are we aligned on, do we have similar human capital? Do we have similar biophysical capital? Do we have similar social capital? To the degrees to which we differ in those things, we would like to specialize accordingly. And we'll talk through that in a little more detail in a moment.
Diversity is our friend in advancing research on shared objectives because diversity in these different types of organizational capabilities creates the opportunity for partnerships according to comparative advantage that simply lets us do more, faster, and better. There's a unique opportunity to put the concept of comparative advantage to effective use in research portfolio management at all levels within CGIAR, from system-level management by the executive management team down to management of individual flagship programs or research projects where one has multiple actors, multiple scientists deployed and multiple candidate partners. Now that one CGIAR structure makes these sorts of portfolio approaches more feasible and more salient, we have a tremendous opportunity to take advantage of the concept of comparative advantage. According to the CGIAR's Independent Science for Development Council, ISDC, ISDC's developed a framework for CGIAR managers at all levels to use to help them to define the methods and the data by which research for development organizations like CGIAR can identify and demonstrate their comparative advantage. And those managers can then apply those methods to CGIAR adaptive research portfolio management. One should be constantly looking at how are we progressing towards achieving our goals? Are we giving up too much in pursuing one goal? Can we make faster progress on another? And are there partners that we could bring in to help us out with the places that we're relatively lagging? The tools that are proposed in the ISDC's framework are not to be applied mechanically. It's not a matter of collecting a set number of data points and computing some opportunity cost ratios and comparing those to other organizations. That's unlikely to be feasible. The key is in asking the central questions posed in the framework and thinking about these organizational capabilities that Josh was just discussing and where is our comparative advantage at whatever level of CGIAR one is managing. So this complements the CGIAR's increasingly mainstream use of quality of research for development. Similarly, we're trying to use best practices and some fundamental principles and questions to ensure the highest quality output from CGIAR given the scarce resources at its disposal?
At a broad level, a comparative advantage analysis involves 4 key steps. First, we need to describe the desired deliverables. And that's not simply a mechanical description, but as Chris said, we need to constantly be talking about the deliverables we're aiming to produce vis-a-vis the broader goals of the organization. So we need to describe those deliverables and articulate how those deliverables help to facilitate our achievement of our collective goals as an organization. Second, we need to identify potential partners. As we've been talking about through this podcast, comparative advantage essentially requires us to understand the capabilities of other actors in the space or other actors who could be in this space. And in many cases, those will be folks who we actively partner with. In some cases, they may be arm's length partners, but we need to understand who those actors are so we can identify their capabilities and understand which activities we are more likely to be better at in a comparative sense, and which they are more likely to be better at in a comparative sense. And in part, that's what we're going to do in step 3. We're going to assess the relative trade-offs involved in our organization pursuing a particular line of research as opposed to other organizations pursuing similar or related lines of research, exploiting, again, as we talked about before, the potential synergies or economies of scope across those activities. And then fourth, we're going to plan partnerships. We're going to refine proposals. This is an iterative process. It is not simply that we quickly describe the deliverables, then identify the partners in the space, talk about the trade-offs, and then finalize a proposal and be done. But rather, by the time we get to step 4 in this process, we're often going back to step 1 and saying, well, maybe we need to refine the scope or the boundaries of our desired deliverables here to make sure that we're engaged in the set of activities that we are comparatively best at vis-a-vis the capabilities of our potential partners. I want to be clear to note here that while I describe this as a sequential process, it is an iterative process, and the sequences are a little fluid. Identifying potential partners came second in my list, but that's not meant to discard or disregard the involvement of existing partners in step 1 in formulating the proposals more broadly. We often work with partners to describe those deliverables. And then again, we're going to come back to those partners, those same partners, as well as a broader set of partners who may be active in that space to understand in step 3, the relative capabilities and trade-offs. In step 4, planning those partnerships and refining those proposals. I think the key thing to take away from this process in general, not just this 4-step process, but the process of conducting comparative advantage analysis, to use a bit of a cliche, is to say that this is as much about the journey as the destination. It may be that through engaging in this iterative process, we learn a lot about ourselves as an organization, our capabilities as an organization, and the capabilities of other organizations. We may even learn of new organizations that could be playing in this space that weren't before. And that is tremendously valuable as we go and we continually, this is a dynamic process. Organizations are constantly revisiting, if not their goals, at least the sets of activities they're going to pursue in serving those goals. And that dynamic process is continually served, is benefited by this set of self-interrogative questions that one has to engage in when conducting any comparative advantage analysis. In essence, those 4 steps are the crux of the activity we're performing when conducting a comparative advantage analysis. But there are many layers to each of those steps, and we encourage our listeners to consult the technical note that describes each of those steps in much greater detail.
Josh, those are great points. Thinking about comparative advantage during the project design process as well as throughout the life of a project in the regular revisiting of progress, of how are we proceeding with the achieving the goals, the milestones set out in the original project design. Thinking about comparative advantage throughout that process can lead to identifying especially beneficial, mutually beneficial partnerships. And the purpose of those partnerships is ultimately to increase impact, is to increase CGIAR's effectiveness by enabling partial specialization in the areas in which CGIAR holds comparative advantage, enabling it to redirect some of the scarce resources it has, both financial and human and other resources, towards the system's relative strengths. Comparative advantage analysis is designed to enable research managers to use identification of the differing competencies of distinct organizations to make the whole of CGIAR-oriented research greater than the sum of its parts, to achieve greater impact, to maximize what is accomplished through the available funding targeted at international public goods by effectively leveraging not just its own competencies, but those of its active and prospective partners. And the comparative advantage analysis tool outlined in the ISDC note, which applies the tool retrospectively to a series of CGIAR examples from recent history, but those are retrospective applications. That tool can be applied in a forward-looking manner as well for areas in which CGIAR is making new investments. And it can be applied in a forward-looking manner to also think about where should CGIAR build comparative advantage. Maybe current analysis of organizational competencies relative to other prospective providers suggests that the CGIAR does not presently hold comparative advantage in an area of growing importance, but it is strategically important that it build comparative advantage in that area. The same tools can be used to help make those assessments sensibly, because the same questions of what are the opportunity costs will always apply. One needs to know, if you're trying to build a comparative advantage of CGIAR in an area of especially important agricultural research for development space, then you're going to be necessarily sacrificing comparative advantage in some other area. So what is the opportunity cost of pursuing this new space in which we're relatively less skilled? Is that worth it? That's an assessment that needs to be carefully thought through. Investing in future capacity is taking resources away from current production of desired deliverables. Because of this, research managers who want to expand comparative advantage over time in a particular direction simply need to go through the same sorts of assessments, not just for the current static situation, but in a forward-looking fashion. Why is building our expertise in a particular area so that we will, in time, have comparative advantage? Why is that worthwhile? Why is that worth what CGIAR will have to give up and what our partners will wind up sacrificing as we shift emphasis from one area to another? How will those projected benefits be assessed, prospectively as well as retrospectively? We must identify alternative uses of resources at every step along the way as good research managers in order to make wise investments. That doesn't mean slavishly adhering to what we're presently really good at, but it does mean using those same tools and thought processes to think carefully about whether it's really worth investing in trying to build up expertise in areas where we don't presently have comparative advantage. Any analysis of comparative advantage can't be conclusive. There will always be some uncertainty, nor can it be fully quantitative. The real task here is disciplined consideration of the goals and the capabilities and the incentives of ourselves as well as other actors within the ecosystem in which we're operating. And that sort of process of deliberate qualitative, not always quantitative, deliberation will strengthen the CGIAR's understanding of its position in the broader agricultural research for development ecosystem, where lots of other organizations of various stripes are operating, some of them profit-minded, some of them public goods production-minded, Some of them focused very narrowly on very specific spaces within countries or at country or regional level. Others focus globally. This comparative advantage analysis framework advanced in the ISDC note can provide a useful tool for organizations, research managers to think about how to wisely deploy the scarce resources at their disposal to most effectively advance the shared objectives to which the CGIAR is committed. Concluding that an outside entity has comparative advantage in one area is not an admission that that organization is superior to CGIAR in that or any other area. Rather, it's simply an acknowledgement that there are always trade-offs and that there is diversity among organizations, and that diversity of talents and opportunities can be harnessed to mutual advantage, that there are always competing goals, and trade-offs across those competing goals mean focusing efforts in areas in which other actors cannot as effectively advance shared goals is an area in which CGIAR could usefully focus. An organization committed to producing international public goods like CGIAR has to advance shared non-commercial objectives and has to be very disciplined in its stewardship of scarce system resources. That's necessary to achieve objectives that are set out explicitly for CGIAR, and it's important to build investor confidence in CGIAR, that it will do the things in which it is relatively best equipped to handle. It will partner with those who are comparatively better at it in accomplishing other tasks, and it can be relied upon to manage the scarce resources made available to it wisely to the interests of the shared global community that is interested in agricultural research for development.
I completely agree, Chris. I think the important thing to recognize is that as any one of us steps away from the narrow agendas that pervade our daily lives, meeting targets for a particular project, managing the folks in our immediate vicinity, we step back and we think about the deepest and broadest goal of our organization, which is thinking about how to retool and reorganize agricultural systems to help feed the world's population, and in particular the world's poor, we then can more easily succumb to this idea that it doesn't matter how we get there as long as we get there. And so what we want to do is we want to deploy resources in the most effective way to achieve the biggest impact on those goals.
Very well said, Josh. Thanks so much, not just for your excellent comments here. It's been fun discussing this with you, but especially for your invaluable contributions to the ISDC program of work on comparative advantage. I hope everyone finds this work useful. Thank you very much for tuning in.